In this video, we're going to start to look at the HTTP process. This process essentially is the flow that your application will go through as you are interacting between web browser client and web server. So we're kind of wanting to just talk about this and how this communication works and how do we take advantage of this communication process and make it work to our advantage. So if we kind of step into this first, I'm sure you're familiar with using the internet. It's very simplistic from our perspective as a user. We open up a web browser, Internet Explorer, Chrome, Firefox, any of the like, and we go up to the address bar and we type in www.google.com and we hit enter. Upon doing that, a page loads up on our screen. We interact with it. We type in a Google search, let's say, and we hit search. Comes back with a series of responses. We click a link, and then that link goes out to the internet, quote unquote, loads up a page, and that page comes back and shows up on our screen. And that's how the internet works. Well, it's not quite as overly glamorous as I may have described it. Rather, it is a series of requests and responses, negotiating content and relying on the third party to provide you that content. So just looking at this diagram in front of you, you'll see that we have basically two parties involved. We have a client and we have a server. The client sends a request to the server, and then the server sends a response back to the client. And that process, in its most simplistic way, is the HTTP process, the Hypertext Transfer Protocol. That was developed back in the 90s, and we use it still today. So, that process takes a request, and if we kind of go back to our scenario, the start of our request was www.google.com. We type in that request, that address, and that domain name, www.google.com, is translated into an IP address. That IP address is the address of the server out on the internet, and that tells our browser that it needs to go out and make a connection, a request, to that server in order to get a web page. So our browser goes out and it connects to Google's IP address. The Google server accepts that request and processes it. And since this is the initial request, Google has a default response, which is the Google homepage, and then returns back to us the Google homepage. And that Google homepage is primarily just the Google logo and then a text box with a search button. And that is the web page that was developed that sits on the Google server and is sent back as a response to our client, the browser. We type in our search result or our query, hit enter. That request then is sent back to the server. The text that we typed into that text box is packaged up and it's sent along as part of the request. The server does some processing of that text, packages up a new web page for us with our result links, and ships that response back to our browser, which then renders that HTML page out and presents us with our links. We click a link, that link points to a URL, that URL is translated into an IP address, and that IP address is then the address of the next server for the next website that we're wanting to connect to. And that process goes over and over, back and forth, and that's the essential relationship between your computer, the client, and just about any server on the internet. Now, with this course, we'll be dealing with a specific version or type of server, which is referred to as an IIS, or Microsoft Internet Information Server. The process of communication is still fairly similar, but we're kind of look a little bit deeper now at how that server component works. So we have our client on the left side, we have our server on the right side, and then within our curly brackets of our server, we could kind of look at this rectangular module and almost divide it down the middle. We have on the left hand side of that module, we have IIS. That is the web server engine. developed by Microsoft. That also hosts all of our ASP.NET MVC applications, which is located on the right side. So if we look at IIS on the left, we have HTML and JPEG. So when we make a web request to a server and we're requesting an HTML document or a JPEG image, those content items are served up directly by IIS. There is no coding involved in terms of like actual C# code or anything like that. It's just you build an HTML page, you put it on a server, a web page request comes in, that HTML page is then shipped to the client, and the client renders out that web page. It's essentially the mechanics that you did when you did your web development course previously, when you learn HTML, JavaScript, CSS. The topic that we'll be covering for the rest of this course is that second half of the module, which is that ASP.NET component. Now this diagram in particular is slightly dated, but the idea here is that you have this handoff engine, this ASP.NET engine, that is actually handling the requests. So those requests can come in many fashions. You can have what are called ASPX pages, ASMX web services. Within the MVC realm, we actually have what are called controllers and views, and all of that content is packaged up, processed. All that C# code that we write is processed by that ASP.NET engine and then is actually converted into HTML documents, which are then passed to IIS, which are then ultimately passed back to our client. So as we build our web pages within ASP.NET, we're actually building pages that generate HTML and then ship that HTML back to the client, because the client's web browser is designed to process HTML, JavaScript, style sheets, and images, and now video, thanks to HTML5. But those are the basic mechanics. The client doesn't suddenly know how to read C# code. The client doesn't suddenly know how to interpret DLL files or any of those things. It still relies on those basic mechanics of I make a request and I receive back an HTML document. So all of the work of making the request and then receiving an HTML document is relying on the server to be able to process that request, which we do with code, and then respond with an HTML document. So let's dig a little deeper. So if we look at the ASP.NET MVC model, again, this is still very high level, but to give you perspective, you can follow the arrows, and they're numbered. So you start off with the browser on the far left end. That request goes into IIS, and in this case, IIS 7. IIS uses what's called a routing engine, and it will identify whether the request can be handled by IIS or if it needs to go off to the ASP.NET engine to be processed. And in this diagram, it assumes that it does, so the request then gets passed to what's called an ASP.NET controller. And that controller basically is a function, or I'm sorry, the controller itself is a class. And inside of that class, you have functions, and each one of those functions performs a specific task. One of those actions, or one of those functions, would be to return the default page. So that controller would then go out, and maybe if there's code that it needs to use or models, it will go out and fetch a model or a piece of data and retrieve that, and then it would actually process that into a view. And that view is the template for the HTML page that's ultimately returned back to the browser. So following along here, we have controller. The controller, number 4, makes a request for models. That request comes back as part of number 4. Controller then makes a request for the view, or that HTML template. That comes back as well. The controller then processes all those pieces together and then returns back a complete HTML document to IIS, and then IIS takes those final pieces and passes those back to the browser. So the request from the browser is made to the web server, IIS. That is then handed off to the ASP.NET engine, which are essentially steps 2 through 6. And then once all of that is completed, step 7 is IIS takes the HTML document and passes that back to the browser. So that is the HTTP process, as well as a high-level look at the MVC process. So if we look at ASP.NET Stack, ASP.NET is kind of an umbrella term that's used for a lot of different services and products. So ASP.NET, the stack is at the bottom, that's kind of the umbrella, and then we have our different sets of technologies broken out into two groups, sites and services. Sites are they're ASP.NET sites, and there are different technologies. Many of these now overlap with one another, but those are kind of original technologies that work together to allow you to build websites using ASP.NET. So what we'll be focusing on throughout the course of our time together will be MVC, and coupled with that will be the ASP.NET web pages, which I'll talk about more as we get into views in later lectures. A more legacy technology that's still used is ASP.NET Web Forms. I developed with Web Forms for over 10 years. It's still a great technology, but a lot of the development push that has come from other technologies such as Ruby on Rails, even more of the current Java MVC type frameworks, Node.js and things like that have really pushed people into using more MVC based architectures. On the right hand side we have services. We'll be touching briefly on Web API, and Web API follows much of the same model as MVC, where you have a controller and you have a series of functions, which are your actions, and you build these web APIs to interact and make requests from JavaScript to the server and the server back to JavaScript, or if you're wanting to build any sort of web services, Web API works great for doing those types of things. SignalR is a relatively newer technology, and it utilizes a combination of Web API and just raw HTTP, and allows you, and actually newer technologies including WebSockets, and it allows you to do more real-time communication between your client and the server. So if you think of applications like chat apps or real-time gaming, if you're familiar at all with HTML5's ability to use the canvas and be able to draw 3D modeling and things like that right within the browser, in order to do those effectively in a real-time gaming type of approach, you need to have that consistent connection between your browser and your server. So SignalR is a stack that enables you to do that, again, still utilizing the HTTP technologies, but making them in a more .NET friendly way, and allowing you to do it not only in ASP.NET apps, but you can also use SignalR in C# apps, Windows Store apps, and Windows Phone apps. So it's a really nice little piece of technology that works in a lot of different areas. This last slide is just to give you a more in-depth perspective of how the HTTP process works in relationship to ASP.NET. I won't go into it in a whole lot of fine detail, but the idea here is that you have your client at the bottom, which is your browser or your computer. It tunnels through the internet. It gets picked up by the HTTP protocol stack. This is the kind of entry point into IIS. From there, it's then handed off to a service host, which is basically a small process running on your computer. The service host then looks at the application config, processes that request, identifies who is the host for that request, then passes that back to the service host. The service host will, in most cases, hand it off to the World Wide Web Publishing Service. That service then spins up an application pool, which is your ASP.NET engine. That engine then processes the request, passes the results, the HTML page, back to the HTTP protocol stack component, and then from there that gets sent back to the browser. So again, this is just to give you another perspective of how that HTTP process works. So I hope this has provided you with a good high-level overview of the HTTP process, how that works, how your browser and your servers work together, because as we get into this, we're going to be focusing primarily on everything above the line in this diagram. we're going to be working specifically on that server code and how what happens in our browser gets back to us, and then how we take what was sent to us from our browser and send back a good solid response to the user.